August 2, 1939. Nassau Point, Long Island, New York. On a summer day in a quiet cabin at Peconic, a short typed page, signed by Albert Einstein and largely written by the Hungarian physicist Leó Szilard, began a chain of decisions that would lead, within 6 years, to the construction of the deadliest weapon the United States had ever created. The letter, dated August 2, 1939, warned President Franklin D. Roosevelt that recent discoveries in nuclear fission made it possible, at least in theory, to create bombs of unprecedented destructive power. And it urged the United States to take immediate steps to secure uranium supplies and support research into chain reactions. What followed was a slow, careful, and then suddenly frenetic movement of people, money, science, and industry that transformed an academic thought experiment into the Manhattan Project, and finally, into the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. This is a story about a civilian, not a general or a minister, whose technical insight and moral urgency forced the hand of a nation, Leó Szilard, an émigré physicist who had been haunted for years by the possibility of a self-sustaining chain reaction, and who, in 1939, took the risky step of turning private scientific alarm into a public political intervention. Szilard had first sketched the idea of exploiting nuclear chain reactions as early as the 1930s, and had even pursued a patent related to reactor concepts while living in London in 1933. A fact that shows he had been thinking about nuclear chain reactions long before the discovery of fission made the problem immediate. Szilard's approach was not a soldier's command, but a citizen's initiative. He and a handful of fellow émigré physicists believed that the ethical cost of silence was higher than the cost of acting. And so they sought out a way to communicate the danger to the most powerful person in the country. What they produced was not an order, but a warning, couched in precise technical terms and shored up by the prestige of Einstein's signature. Why call this an illegal idea, in quotation marks? Because the modern vocabulary of secrecy, national security, and scientific ethics did not sit comfortably with the notion of a civilian engineering a weapon. Many scientists felt that transforming laboratory phenomena into instruments of mass destruction violated long-standing moral codes. Others worried that recruiting civilian scientists into military projects would blur the lines between academic freedom and state coercion. The label illegal is not meant to allege a criminal act by Szilard or Einstein. There is no historical record that they broke the law in drafting or sending the letter, but rather to capture the sense, among some contemporaries and later critics, that their intervention trespassed on ethical boundaries that scientists had only recently begun to respect. In practical terms, though, it is more accurate to say that Szilard's initiative was unauthorized by any government body until it forced itself into the political arena, effectively bending the machinery of state to an idea that had originated in civilian laboratories. To understand how one civilian could alter the course of history, we must look at three linked elements: the scientific reality Szilard had grasped, the unique political moment of 1939 when American alarm could be mobilized, and the networks of influence that allowed a warning letter to become an actionable program. Scientifically, by early 1939, the discovery of fission by Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann and its interpretation by Lisa Meitner had shown that splitting heavy nuclei released enormous energy. The theoretical leap that Szilard and others made was to see that if enough fissile material were assembled, neutrons released by fission could induce further fissions in a chain reaction, releasing energy exponentially. That was the science. Szilard's role was to convert that abstract possibility into a strategic problem. If Germany or another hostile power developed such a weapon first, the balance of power could be overturned. Politically, 1939 was a tinderbox. Nazi Germany had already annexed Austria and Czechoslovakia, and its aggression across Europe was clear. The United States was still officially neutral, but American policymakers were watching developments with concern. Szilard and his colleagues recognized this as a moment when a carefully framed warning might mobilize the American government's vast resources. They therefore enlisted Alexander Sachs, an economist and advisor with White House access, to place the letter in front of President Roosevelt at a time when the administration would pay attention. Sachs did so on October 11, 1939. After the letter had been drafted, and after Szilard had personally handed the documents to him in mid-August. Sax's meeting with Roosevelt and his insistence on the strategic stakes were pivotal in prompting the president to act. Roosevelt's response was cautious but consequential. He authorized the creation of the Advisory Committee on Uranium, chaired by Lyman Briggs, to examine the claims and to decide whether and how the federal government should proceed. Initially, the committee moved slowly. Funding was limited, and many officials considered the prospects for a deliverable weapon remote, but the seed had been planted. Over the next 2 years, incremental experiments, most notably the work of Enrico Fermi, Eugene Wigner, and other émigré scientists, began to show that the theoretical calculations could be turned into laboratory reality. The United States steadily scaled up its commitment, and by 1942, the Manhattan Project, under Army supervision and directed by Major General Leslie Groves and scientific leadership from J. Robert Oppenheimer, among others, had become a vast industrial military endeavor. What Szilard personally contributed was not the final engineering design of an atomic bomb, but the act of transgression, turning private scientific unease into public pressure. He recognized that the normal channels of scientific discourse, peer-reviewed papers, academic conferences, were too slow and too detached from political reality. So he and his compatriots bypassed those channels. They crafted a text that translated technical risk into political urgency, and used Einstein's fame as a lever to ensure the message would be read at the highest levels. That tactical use of celebrity, coupled with a precise technical rationale, made the difference between an obscure theoretical possibility and a national security priority. The pathway from letter to bomb was not linear or inevitable. There were delays, internal debates, and genuine uncertainty about feasibility. Early estimates suggested that the amount of fissionable material required might be measured in tons, not kilograms, rendering any air-deliverable weapon impractical. Those estimates changed as experiments refined the critical mass calculations, and as British and American researchers, including the Frisch-Piles Memorandum in Britain and subsequent Anglo-American scientific exchanges, provided better data. The Manhattan Project itself represented a radical upscaling. Laboratories gave way to pilot plants, and pilot plants gave way to full-scale industrial sites at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, Hanford, Washington, and the weapons design laboratories at Los Alamos, New Mexico. Each site was a response to a technical bottleneck: isotope separation at Oak Ridge, plutonium production at Hanford, and design and testing at Los Alamos. The human shape of this story is crucial. Szilard was one of many émigré scientists whose moral calculus was shaped by the rise of fascism in Europe. He had fled Hungary, lived in Berlin, and emigrated to Britain and then the United States, witnessing firsthand the erosion of democratic institutions and the persecutions of colleagues. That experience made the prospect of a German atomic bomb not an abstract worry, but an existential threat to countless lives and to the international order he valued. Many of the scientists involved did not relish the idea of weaponizing their work. Indeed, after the war, Szilard became a prominent voice for arms control and cautioned against the unchecked spread of nuclear weapons. The paradox is stark. The very people who enabled the bomb's construction would later regret or resist its proliferation. Technically, the Manhattan Project solved a set of engineering problems that Szilard's letter did not attempt to answer. How to enrich uranium-235 out of a sea of uranium-238. How to produce plutonium in sufficient quantity and purity. How to design a device that would compress or assemble critical mass rapidly enough to create a supercritical reaction before the device blew itself apart. Each of these questions required industrial-scale facilities, novel chemistry and metallurgy, and a coordination between military logistics and academic physics that had no precedent. The answer was to meld military project management with academic expertise, creating a command structure that could recruit the necessary labor and money. This was not a single inventor's triumph, but a distributed achievement, yet without the initial political authorization triggered by the civilian letter. The scale and speed required would likely not have been mobilized in time for 1945. There is also a legal and ethical trace to follow. The Manhattan Project operated under strict secrecy and with broad wartime powers granted to the military. Scientists working on the project were subject to security clearances and non-disclosure rules. The project's compartmentalization was a deliberate strategy to limit leakage and to maintain control. In this frame, Szilard's civilian initiative was the opening act of a much longer legal reconfiguration. The federal government assumed extraordinary authority over scientific information and industrial production in the name of national security, and after the war those precedents shaped Cold War governance, export controls, and the relationship between science and state. Again, Szilard's move did not itself create these policies, but it forced the system to respond and adapt rapidly. The consequences were immediate and far-reaching. By July 16, 1945, the Trinity test in the New Mexico desert showed a successfully detonated plutonium device. And on August 6 and 9, the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. These events brought World War II to a close in the Pacific theater, but also inaugurated the nuclear age, a world in which nations would build arsenals measured in megatons, and where civilian scientists would forever be entwined with questions of war, deterrence, and ethics. The sequence that began with a civilian warning letter ended with a geopolitical shift that few had anticipated in 1939. The United States held an unprecedented monopoly on nuclear weapons for a brief period, and then a costly and dangerous arms race ensued. Finally, what can we learn from this episode about the power of civilian initiative? First, it shows that scientific knowledge is not politically neutral. When technology promises massive consequences, scientists can become de facto strategists. Second, it demonstrates how individuals operating outside formal authority can, through networks and symbolic capital, force governments to change course. Third, and perhaps most sobering, it reveals that moral clarity does not guarantee moral righteousness. Many of the people who pushed for development did so believing they were preventing a greater evil. Yet the outcome produced horrors of its own. Szilard's illegal ideas. We accept the term as shorthand for an unauthorized civilian act that crossed ethical boundaries embodies the ambiguous mixture of courage and hubris, of foresight and unintended consequence that marks so many technological revolutions. In the end, the story is not merely about bombs or policy. It is about responsibility. The Einstein-Szilard letter is a reminder that ideas have consequences, and that those who see danger may feel compelled to act, even when institutions hesitate. Leó Szilard did not build the bomb by himself, but his idea and his insistence were a catalyst without which the trajectory of American nuclear development might have been markedly different. That small, typed page from a Long Island cabin changed the priorities of a nation, and set in motion forces that reshaped the strategic and moral landscape of the modern world. The immediate aftermath of the Manhattan Project's success revealed both the strategic utility of Szilard's intervention and the moral complexity it left in its wake. Szilard himself, who had urged decisive action in 1939, reacted to the use of atomic weapons with a mixture of horror and activism. He and other scientists moved quickly after 1945 to shape the post-war conversation about control of nuclear technology, advocating for international inspections, arms control, and civilian oversight. Szilard drafted proposals for an international authority to govern atomic energy and warned that secrecy and unilateral national arsenals would create perpetual instability. These proposals, while influential among certain circles, were unable to overcome the geopolitical realities of wartime rivalry and emerging Cold War tensions. The politics of secrecy that followed the Manhattan Project were both a response to wartime necessity and a template for Cold War governance. The wartime mobilization required that industrial-scale isotope separation and plutonium production be conducted under the strictest compartmentalization. Oak Ridge's gaseous, diffusion, and electromagnetic separation plants, Hanford's reactors and chemical separations, and Los Alamos's ordnance-scale design work were all classified and guarded, and the workforce was partitioned into need-to-know cells. Security concerns hardened into policy after the war. Classification systems, export controls, and the institutionalization of national laboratories became permanent features of the U.S. scientific landscape. In hindsight, Szilard's civilian action precipitated not only a new class of weapons, but also a new legal and bureaucratic architecture for modern science. There were immediate technical payoffs and costs. The Manhattan Project solved critical problems in metallurgy, neutron physics, and large-scale project management. It produced trained cadres of physicists, engineers, and technicians, who later migrated into civilian industry, national laboratories, and university research programs, accelerating post-war American science and technology in ways that reshaped the economy. At the same time, the project's appetite for secrecy and state control introduced a pattern of classified research that sometimes inhibited open scientific exchange and placed ethical constraints on researchers who otherwise might have pursued purely peaceful work. The do-lose nature of nuclear physics, its capacity to power both reactors and bombs, that civilian initiatives could be converted into military programs with surprising speed when political priorities changed. On an institutional level, Szilard's intervention and the wartime experience catalyzed debates over civilian versus military control of atomic energy. The United States considered models that ranged from direct military control to a publicly accountable civilian authority. The eventual outcome, the Atomic Energy Act of 1946, established civilian oversight through the newly created Atomic Energy Commission, while leaving open the possibility of military involvement for national security demands. This shift reflected a compromise, recognizing both the need for democratic oversight of scientific power and the realities of strategic imperatives. The legal architecture that emerged sought to legitimize the state's role in stewarding a dangerous technology while imagining frameworks, however, imperfect for democratic accountability. But Szilard's influence was not confined to institutional debates. His private ideas and moral commitments shaped public conversations and professional organizing. After the war, he became an outspoken critic of the decision to use atomic bombs without prior demonstration or international consultation. He circulated a petition, signed by dozens of Manhattan Project scientists, urging President Truman to refrain from using nuclear weapons against Japan without first pursuing a public demonstration and international talks. The petition did not change the course of events in 1945, but it did establish that a community of scientists was pushing back against the unilateral uses of scientific power they had helped enable. That tension between technical achievement and moral responsibility would recur through the Cold War and into contemporary debates about emerging technologies. The narrative also highlights a complex truth about individual agency. Szilard's action is an example of how a technically informed civilian can exercise outsized influence on national policy. He was not a politician. He did not command troops or major financial resources. He had technical credibility, moral urgency, and a willingness to leverage social capital. Einstein's name, Sax's access, and networks among émigré scientists to transform an intellectual risk into political priority. The episode raises a perennial question. When does a citizen's duty to warn outweigh institutional caution? The historical record suggests that, in Szilard's estimation, the risk of silence in 1939 justified an extraordinary political intervention. Whether that judgment was right or wrong is the central moral conundrum of the story. Equally instructive are the philosophical and ethical ripples. The Einstein-Szilard intervention made scientists into actors in grand strategic questions, and that role carries both power and burden. After 1945, many scientists felt an obligation to shape the governance of the technologies they had developed, out of both moral conviction and a recognition of the practical consequences of leaving such questions solely to politicians and generals. An entire literature of science and ethics was seeded by this period, and institutions, professional societies, advisory boards, and eventually international bodies developed to negotiate the boundaries between discovery and its applications. These debates continue today in areas such as artificial intelligence, biotechnology, and climate engineering, where technical communities sometimes feel compelled to step into the political arena. From a strategic perspective, the project that Szilard's letter helped catalyze also reshaped global power. The atomic bombs of 1945 created a new threshold for coercive capability. Nuclear weapons were not merely tactically significant, they were strategically foundational. The United States' early advantage gave it leverage in the early Cold War. But the symmetry of the nuclear age, once the Soviet Union tested a weapon in 1949, meant that the new technology rapidly became a source of mutual existential deterrence, rather than unilateral dominance. Szilard's intervention had, in short, opened a Pandora's box. The initial U.S. breakthrough altered the structure of international relations in ways that created both stability, through deterrence, and persistent danger, through arms proliferation. It is also important to examine the personal consequences for Szilard. The scientist who had pushed for action felt a deep sense of responsibility after witnessing the bomb's effects, and spent the remainder of his life advocating for restraint. He became a prominent voice in discussions about international control, and served as an example of a scientist who, having helped create a technology, chose to campaign for its limitation. Szilard's post-war activism illuminates the internal contradictions many technical experts face. Commitment to scientific truth, on one hand, and the attempt to mitigate the human costs of technological consequences on the other. Szilard's career, after the war, is thus a study in moral complexity. A scientist-activist trying to repair what his earlier action had helped unleash. Turning to practical lessons, historians and ethicists draw several takeaways from this sequence. One is the necessity of anticipatory governance. When scientific advances promise transformative power, governments and professional communities must develop mechanisms to evaluate risks, consult diverse stakeholders, and deliberate openly about potential uses. Another is the value and danger of individual initiative. Citizens and scientists can act as essential catalysts, but unilateral interventions by technically capable actors can produce outcomes that the institutionally responsible may not endorse or control. Finally, there is the enduring lesson about transparency and public engagement. Extraordinary technological choices that affect the whole of humanity arguably demand a level of public deliberation and consent far beyond what a small cadre of experts can provide. These lessons are now staples of debates about emerging technologies and global risks. In the historical record, the Einstein-Szilard episode serves as both a cautionary tale and a testament to civic responsibility. It reminds us that the line between moral obligation and overreach is often ambiguous, and that the decisions of a few technically informed individuals can reverberate through institutions and across generations. Szilard's intervention underscores the fact that science does not exist in a vacuum. It is embedded in social, political, and moral contexts that shape how discoveries are used. By examining this moment closely, we can better understand the recurring dilemmas that arise whenever powerful technologies are newly possible. To conclude, the story of how one civilian's action helped enable America's deadliest weapon is not a simple tale of heroic foresight or malicious intent. It is a layered narrative of fear, responsibility, institutional inertia, and technological translation. Szilard and his colleagues perceived a danger, calculated a risk, and used the tools at their disposal to compel national action. The consequences were immediate, an epical trinity: Hiroshima, Nagasaki. But the longest-lasting impact may be the moral and institutional. Debates they sparked about the governance of scientific power. Men and women who work at the edges of knowledge will continue to face choices that have weight, and the Einstein-Szilard letter will remain a reference point for anyone who asks what it means for a civilian to act on a perilous idea. As we approach the end of our remembrance today, we're grateful you listened to this full story with us, and we're glad our archive has nourished your heart and soul. War stories have probably also marked your family's life in some way, haven't they? Maybe you wore the uniform yourself, or perhaps someone you loved did. Your father, a grandfather, or even an uncle. If so, we'd like to invite you to add another chapter to this record. Share with our community a war story that resonates in your family in the comments below. It could be a family tale, a saved letter, a lesson learned on a flight line, or in a muddy field. Anything you want. Tell us from where and what time are you listening to this message. This contribution helps to grow and keep our community together. We can't let these incredible stories be lost in time. The World War II Archives channel was created to honor and preserve these memories. Finally, if this resonates with you, We invite you to subscribe and perhaps share it with a friend who also recognizes the importance of these tales. Stay tuned so you don't miss the next one of our lost archives yet to come.